We've been discussing a great deal about the semi-permeable nature of the cell membrane. We've been talking about its construction, its phospholipid bilayer, and regions of water solubility and regions of lipid solubility. As we get into, we're going to utilize that information, and we're going to get into a lot in terms of the function of the cell membrane. So just as we've reinforced so far throughout at least up to this point, and it'll continue as such, we've reinforced the fact that we have this given structure and it facilitates a given function. And so we're going to talk about that a great deal. And one of the things we want to go into in our next objective is we want to look at these proteins. We identified them as being integral proteins, as being peripheral proteins in terms of their placement, some of them being integral proteins that are transmembrane proteins. In other words, they cross completely through the cell membranes. Well, again, structure determines function, so there's a reason for that. Those membrane proteins can have different functions depending on obviously what they were constructed for. They can act as, and we're going to get each of these in detail, but just kind of as a preview here, an introduction. They can function as ion channels, they can function as carriers, both with or without the use of energy. They function as receptors, enzymes, and we're going to define that a little bit, and linkers as well as cell identity markers. So we'll kind of look at each of these. Now, this goes back to something we've reinforced where with the semi-permeable nature of our cell membrane, with its construction, it easily facilitates the movement of molecules through the membrane if they're small, if they're neutrally charged, and if they're lipid soluble. Well, if they're not, well then what are we going to do? And so truly what we're going to do is we're going to utilize, in the case of ions, we're going to utilize what we refer to as ion channels. So these are proteins that are constructed in such a way that allow ions to pass. Typically when it's just a channel, these are going to move down their concentration gradient. We're going to be getting into that in great detail here in a minute. But what we're saying is we're creating this semi-permeable environment where something exists on one side of the membrane in different amounts than, or different concentrations than what it exists on the opposite side. And so there's a desire there to reach that equilibrium. But due to the fact that the membrane doesn't allow them to move, then they have to stay in that position until we facilitate some way for them to move. And these ion channels are a great example. That, for example, if I have more sodium outside the cell and less sodium inside, that they have to sit there until we open a channel that's specific to that sodium ion. Or if we have potassium being, and I'm giving you the normal here when I'm talking about sodium being more outside than inside. Well, when it comes to potassium, there's more inside than outside. And so it's sitting there with more potassium inside than there is outside. And what we define that as, or what we make a statement as, is that there's a gradient that exists. There's a difference. So whenever you hear that term gradient, kind of think of it as a difference. So there is a difference between the concentration of one side of the membrane and the other, and we refer to that as a concentration gradient. We'll also talk about differences in charges, positive charges and negative charges. Therefore, there's also very often established an electrical gradient as well. And so when we look at these, we can have that gradient exist, and then by opening these channels, we can allow then that ion that's specific, that channel is specific for, we can allow it to move along that gradient. Okay? It's like damming up water, that as soon as we open the floodgates, the water wants to go from where it's highest in concentration, or where there's more water, to where there's less water. It's just the dam is in the way. We're doing the same thing here. We're basically intracellularly and extracellularly damming up ions, and then when we open the floodgates, when we open the channel, then we can allow them to move. Some of these are open all the time. Many of them are gated because there's specific times when we want them to open and close. And so it allows that movement. Now, another way that we allow molecules to move is by using carriers. Now, sometimes these carriers can require energy. Sometimes they don't require energy. And so basically the difference there is if I want something to move from where it's high in terms of its concentration to low, that doesn't take a whole lot of effort. You open the floodgates, water flows out. Now, going the other way does present an issue to us. That let's say we have a dam holding water in a reservoir, and we want it to go from the riverside back up and over. Well, that takes energy. That takes a pump to do that. And we do the same thing. If we want something to move with its gradient, remember I said use the term difference? If I want it to move with its difference, no energy required. If I want it to move against its gradient or against its difference, well, now I got to expend a little energy to do that. We're going to be getting that in great detail very shortly. So where does that energy come from? Well, the energy can come from our energy-containing molecule, ATP. We can also utilize gradients of other molecules to help drive secondary molecules to be able to move as well. We'll be getting into that.